Every morning she cut his toast. Every morning he trembled. Nobody knew the old man's secret would change everything. The bell above Sunrise Diner's door chimed its familiar tune as Emma wiped down the counter for the third time that morning. The early shift always started the same way. Coffee brewing, eggs crackling on the grill, and the gentle hum of regulars settling into their usual spots. But there was one customer who made every morning different. One who had unknowingly become the reason she actually looked forward to coming to work. Harold shuffled through the door at exactly 7:15, just as he had for the past 8 months. His weathered hands gripped a worn wooden cane, and his steps were careful, measured. The other waitresses barely glanced up anymore. He was just another elderly customer in a city full of them. But Emma always noticed. She noticed how his fingers trembled when he reached for his wallet, how he struggled to butter his toast, how he sat alone in the corner booth by the window, watching the world wake up outside. "Good morning, Harold," Emma called out with genuine warmth, already reaching for the coffee pot. The other customers might see a frail old man, but Emma saw something else. A dignity that couldn't be diminished by age, a quiet strength that spoke of stories untold. Harold's face lit up with the kind of smile that seemed to make the entire diner brighter. "Morning, dear. Same as always, if you don't mind." Emma had memorized his order long ago. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, and black coffee. Simple, consistent, just like Harold himself. But it wasn't the order that made their morning routine special. It was everything else. As she poured his coffee, Emma noticed Harold's hands shaking more than usual. The cup rattled against the saucer as he tried to lift it, and she could see the frustration flash across his weathered features. Without saying a word, she steadied the cup, helping guide it to his lips. "Thank you, sweetheart," Harold whispered, his voice thick with gratitude that seemed too deep for such a small gesture. Emma's heart clenched. In a world where everyone was always rushing, always busy, always somewhere else, Harold reminded her that sometimes the most important moments were the quiet ones, the moments when someone simply needed another person to care. When his breakfast arrived, Emma watched Harold struggle with the butter knife. His arthritis was particularly bad today, she could tell. The other customers were absorbed in their phones, their newspapers, their own lives. The other waitresses were busy with their own tables, but Emma couldn't just walk away. "Let me help with that," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him. Harold's eyes misted over as Emma carefully buttered his toast, cutting it into manageable pieces. She'd done this dozens of times before, but today felt different. Today, there was something fragile about Harold that made her chest tight with concern. "You don't have to do this," Harold said quietly, but his voice carried no conviction. They both knew he needed the help, and they both knew Emma wouldn't stop offering it. "I want to," Emma replied simply, and she meant it. As Harold ate, Emma found herself lingering at his table longer than usual. She refilled his coffee, straightened his napkin, and listened as he told her about the pigeons outside his apartment window. Other customers flagged her down, but somehow Harold's stories seemed more important than impatient demands for more ketchup. "You remind me of someone," Harold said suddenly, his eyes studying Emma's face with an intensity that surprised her. "Someone very special." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Oh, I'm nothing special, Harold. Just doing my job." Harold shook his head slowly. "No, dear. You're doing much more than that. You're treating an old man like he matters, like he's still human. That's rarer than you might think." The weight of his words settled over Emma like a warm blanket. She'd grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home, never quite fitting anywhere. She'd learned early that kindness was often the only currency that really mattered, the only thing that could bridge the gap between strangers. But hearing Harold acknowledge it, seeing how much her small gestures meant to him, made something inside her chest expand. "Everyone matters," Emma said firmly. "Everyone deserves kindness." Harold reached across the table with trembling fingers and gently patted Emma's hand. His skin was papery thin, marked with age spots, and the evidence of a long life lived. But his touch was warm, full of gratitude that made Emma's eyes burn with unexpected tears. "The world needs more people like you," Harold whispered. As the morning rush began to pick up, Emma reluctantly excused herself to tend to other tables. But she kept glancing back at Harold, watching as he slowly finished his breakfast, carefully counted out exact change from a worn leather wallet, and left a tip that was probably too generous for his fixed income. Harold stood to leave, gripping his cane with both hands. He moved slowly toward the door, pausing to nod at Emma one more time. That smile, that gentle wave. It was the highlight of Emma's day. Every single day. "See you tomorrow, Harold," Emma called out. "Wouldn't miss it, dear," Harold replied, and Emma believed him. As the door closed behind him, Emma began clearing his table. She noticed he'd left his usual tip, $3 on a $6 meal. It was more than he could probably afford, she knew, but Harold never failed to leave it. Just like he never failed to thank her, to smile at her, to treat her like she was the most important person in his world during those precious morning minutes. Emma pocketed the tip and started wiping down the table, already counting the hours until Harold would walk through that door again. She had no idea that tomorrow morning would change both of their lives forever. The next morning started like any other, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Harold arrived at his usual time, but today he seemed more fragile, more distant. His usual warm greeting felt subdued, and Emma noticed he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. "Everything all right today, Harold?" Emma asked as she poured his coffee, her voice gentle with concern. Harold managed a weak smile. "Just tired, dear. Old bones don't rest as well as they used to." But Emma sensed there was more to it. In the months she'd been serving Harold, she'd learned to read the subtle changes in his demeanor. Today, something was weighing on him, something beyond his usual physical discomfort. As Emma helped Harold with his breakfast routine, steadying his coffee cup, buttering his toast, cutting it into neat squares, she noticed his hands were shaking worse than ever. When she gently took the fork from his trembling fingers to help him with his eggs, Harold's eyes filled with tears he tried desperately to hide. "I hate being so helpless," Harold whispered, his voice breaking slightly. Emma's heart shattered. She'd seen pride and independence slowly stripped away from people before. It had happened to some of the older foster parents who'd taken her in over the years. The indignity of needing help with basic tasks, the gradual loss of autonomy, it was devastating to witness. "You're not helpless, Harold," Emma said firmly, sitting across from him again, despite the growing crowd of morning customers. "You're here, you're fighting, you're living. That takes courage." Harold looked up at her with such gratitude that Emma had to blink back her own tears. "How did I get so lucky to have you looking after me?" Before Emma could respond, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit approached their table. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, with perfectly styled hair and shoes that probably cost more than Emma made in a month. Everything about him screamed money and importance, which made him stand out dramatically in the humble surroundings of Sunrise Diner. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice crisp and professional. "I'm looking for someone. An elderly gentleman who comes here regularly." Emma felt her protective instincts flare immediately. Harold had gone very still beside her, his face pale. Something about this situation felt wrong, dangerous even. "We get a lot of customers," Emma replied carefully. "Could you be more specific?" The man pulled out a photograph, and Emma's blood ran cold. It was Harold, but a much younger version. In the photo, Harold was wearing an expensive suit, standing in front of what looked like a massive corporate building, surrounded by people in business attire. He looked powerful, important, nothing like the frail man sitting beside her now. "This man," the stranger said, showing the photo to both Emma and Harold. "I have reason to believe he frequents this establishment." Harold's coffee cup clattered against the saucer as his shaking intensified. Emma watched in horror as all the color drained from his face. Whatever this man represented, Harold was terrified. "I'm sorry, but I protect my customers' privacy," Emma said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Harold. "If you're not here to order food, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The stranger's eyes narrowed as he studied Emma's defiant expression. Then his gaze shifted to Harold, who was now staring down at his plate, trying to make himself invisible. "Harold Whitman," the stranger said quietly, and Harold's entire body seemed to shrink into itself. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Emma felt like the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Harold Whitman. The frail, struggling man she'd been caring for had a last name she'd never known, and apparently a past that involved men in expensive suits hunting him down. "I think you have the wrong person," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. The fear in Harold's eyes told her everything she needed to know. The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mr. Whitman, my employers have been very patient, but patience has its limits. We need to talk." Harold finally looked up, and Emma saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not just fear, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Not here," Harold said quietly. "Please, not in front of her." Emma's mind was racing. Employers. What kind of employers sent men in $1,000 suits to track down elderly customers in diners? What kind of past was Harold hiding behind his gentle smiles and polite thank yous? "Actually, Mr. Whitman, I think the young lady might be exactly who we need to speak with," the stranger said, turning his attention fully to Emma. "You've been very kind to Mr. Whitman, haven't you? Very attentive." There was something in his tone that made Emma's skin crawl. "I'm kind to all my customers." But not all customers get personal service, do they? Not all customers have their food cut for them, their coffee steadied, their every need anticipated. The stranger's smile grew wider. "You've grown quite fond of Harold, haven't you?" Emma didn't like where this was going. "What do you want?" "Mr. Whitman has something that belongs to my employers, something very valuable, and it seems he's grown quite attached to you, which makes you useful." Harold suddenly grabbed Emma's hand with both of his trembling ones. "Please," he whispered urgently, "don't get involved in this. Just walk away." But Emma couldn't walk away. Over the past months, Harold had become more than just a customer. He'd become family. He was the grandfather she'd never had, the stable presence she'd always craved. The thought of someone threatening him, using her against him, made anger flare hot in her chest. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Emma said, standing up to face the stranger, "but Harold is under my protection. Whatever business you have with him, you can conduct it somewhere else." The stranger laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Your protection? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with, little girl? Someone who's about to be escorted out by security if he doesn't order something or leave," Emma replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. For a moment, the diner fell silent. Other customers had begun to notice the tense conversation, and Emma could feel their eyes on her. Harold was gripping her hand so tightly it almost hurt, his breathing shallow and rapid. The stranger looked around the diner, taking in the curious stares and growing attention. His jaw tightened with frustration. "This isn't over, Mr. Whitman," he said quietly. "We'll be in touch very soon, and next time we won't be so polite about it." He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving behind a tension so thick Emma could barely breathe. Harold was shaking uncontrollably now, and Emma realized that whatever storm was coming, it was going to change everything. After the stranger left, Emma led Harold to the small employee break room behind the kitchen. Her hands were trembling almost as much as his as she helped him into a worn plastic chair. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Harold's pale face. "Who was that man, Harold?" Emma asked gently, kneeling beside his chair. "And who is Harold Whitman?" Harold buried his face in his hands, and Emma watched in dismay as his shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. She'd never seen him break down like this, and it terrified her more than any threat from mysterious men in expensive suits. "I never wanted you to get involved," Harold whispered through his fingers. "I thought I could just disappear, live quietly, hurt no one. But they found me anyway." Emma placed a comforting hand on Harold's shoulder. "Found you? Harold, what are you running from?" For several long minutes, Harold said nothing. The only sounds were the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the muffled conversations of customers in the dining room. Finally, Harold raised his head and looked at Emma with eyes full of pain and regret. "My real name is Harold Whitman," he began slowly, "and for 30 years, I was the CEO of Whitman Industries." Emma's breath caught. Even she had heard of Whitman Industries. It was one of the largest manufacturing companies in the country, worth billions of dollars. The idea that the frail old man she'd been helping with his breakfast was once the head of such a massive corporation seemed impossible. "I built that company from nothing," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger as he talked. "Started in my garage, worked 18-hour days, sacrificed everything for success. And I achieved it. More success than I ever dreamed possible. But something went wrong," Emma said quietly, sensing the pain in Harold's voice. Harold nodded slowly. Power corrupts, dear. I learned that the hard way. The more successful the company became, the more pressure there was to cut corners, to prioritize profits over people. I told myself it was just business, that everyone did it. But deep down, I knew I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Emma remained silent, letting Harold tell his story at his own pace. She could see how difficult this was for him, how much shame he carried. The breaking point came during a safety inspection at one of our factories, Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. There were violations, serious ones that could have put workers in danger. My executives wanted to hide them, pay off the inspectors, keep production running. The plant employed hundreds of people, supported entire communities. Shutting down for repairs would cost millions. Harold's hands were shaking again, and Emma gently took them in hers, offering what comfort she could. I authorized the cover-up, Harold admitted, tears streaming down his face. I chose money over safety, profits over people. And 3 weeks later, there was an accident. A young man named David Martinez, barely older than you, was killed when faulty equipment failed. He had a wife, a baby daughter. He died because of my decision. Emma felt her own eyes filling with tears. She could see the crushing weight of guilt that Harold had been carrying. Understand now why he seemed so frail, so broken. That's when I knew I couldn't continue, Harold said. I tried to make things right, to compensate the family, to fix the safety issues. But my board of directors saw it differently. They viewed my conscience as a liability, my guilt as weakness. They wanted me gone. So you left? I was forced out, Harold corrected. But not before I gathered evidence of all the company's wrongdoings, safety violations, environmental crimes, tax evasion, bribery, everything. I kept copies of every document, every email, every piece of evidence that showed what Whitman Industries had become under my leadership. Emma was beginning to understand. And that's what they want back. Harold nodded grimly. Those documents could destroy the company, send dozens of executives to prison, cost them billions in fines and lawsuits. But more importantly, they could prevent future accidents, save lives. I've been holding on to them for 2 years, trying to decide what to do. Why haven't you turned them over to the authorities? Harold's laugh was bitter. Because I'm just as guilty as the rest of them, maybe more so. Because I was the one in charge. If I expose them, I expose myself. I'd spend what little time I have left in prison. Emma understood now why Harold had been hiding, why he'd chosen to live in a modest apartment and eat breakfast at a neighborhood diner instead of enjoying the luxury his former position could have afforded. He was a man haunted by his past, paralyzed by guilt and fear. But you can't hide forever, Emma said softly. I thought I could, Harold replied. I thought if I just stayed quiet, stayed invisible, they'd eventually give up and move on. But seeing that man today, seeing how they're willing to threaten you, Harold looked at Emma with desperate eyes. I can't let innocent people get hurt because of my cowardice. Not again. Emma squeezed Harold's hands. You're not a coward, Harold. You made mistakes, yes, but you're trying to make them right. That takes courage. Does it? Or is it just more selfishness, wanting to ease my own conscience? Before Emma could answer, the break room door burst open. Marcus, the diner's manager, stuck his head in, looking frazzled. Emma, there are more men here asking about your customer, Marcus said urgently. Expensive suits, serious faces. They're saying they need to speak with both of you immediately. Emma felt her blood turn to ice. Through the small window in the break room door, she could see into the dining room where 3 more well-dressed men had positioned themselves strategically throughout the restaurant. They weren't trying to blend in or be subtle anymore. They're not going to wait, Harold said quietly. His face resigned. They know they have me cornered. Emma's mind raced. These men, whoever they represented, clearly weren't going to give up. And now they were involving her, threatening her workplace, potentially putting other innocent people at risk. Harold, Emma said firmly, turning to face him. Those documents you mentioned, where are they? Harold's eyes widened. Emma? No, I won't let you get involved in this. It's too dangerous. I'm already involved, Emma replied. They made sure of that when they threatened me. But maybe there's another way, a way that doesn't involve you running forever or innocent people getting hurt. Harold studied her face. seeing something there that reminded him of the young idealist he'd once been, before power and greed had corrupted his moral compass. "The documents are in a safety deposit box," Harold said slowly. "But Emma, you don't understand the forces we're dealing with. These people have unlimited resources, connections in high places. They'll destroy anyone who gets in their way." Emma stood up, her jaw set with determination. Then maybe it's time someone stood up to them. Emma took a deep breath and opened the break room door. The main dining room had transformed into something that felt more like a crime scene than a neighborhood restaurant. The three new men in suits had positioned themselves with military precision, one by the front door, one by the kitchen entrance, and one at the counter. Regular customers were finishing their meals quickly and leaving, sensing the tension that had settled over the space like a thick fog. The original man from earlier was back, standing in the center of the dining room with the confidence of someone who owned the place. When he saw Emma emerge with Harold behind her, his cold smile returned. "Mr. Whitman, Miss..." He paused, waiting for Emma to fill in her name. "Emma," she said firmly, refusing to show the fear that was racing through her veins. "And you are?" "James Morrison, legal counsel for Whitman Industries. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Emma noticed how the other customers had all mysteriously disappeared, leaving only the diner staff and Morrison's associates. Marcus was hovering nervously by the cash register, clearly out of his depth but trying to protect his employees. "This is a public restaurant," Emma said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "If you want to have a private conversation, you can make an appointment like everyone else." Morrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Miss Emma, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Whitman has in his possession certain documents that belong to my client. Documents that were stolen when he violated his confidentiality agreement and fled his position." Harold stepped forward, his cane tapping against the worn linoleum floor. Despite his physical frailty, there was something different about his posture now, a strength that Emma hadn't seen before. "Those documents weren't stolen, Morrison," Harold said, his voice clearer and more authoritative than Emma had ever heard it. "They're evidence of crimes that your client continues to commit, evidence that could save lives." "Evidence of allegations," Morrison corrected smoothly. "Allegations made by a disgruntled former employee who suffered a mental breakdown and abandoned his responsibilities." Emma felt anger flare in her chest. "Mental breakdown? This man comes in here every morning, treats everyone with kindness and respect, and pays for his meals with money he can barely afford. If that's what you call a breakdown, the world needs more of it." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Emma more carefully. "You've grown quite attached to Mr. Whitman, haven't you? It would be a shame if your friendship were to cause problems for you. I imagine a young woman in your position can't afford to lose her job." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Emma felt her hands clench into fists. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality," Morrison replied calmly. "Mr. Whitman's delusions have already cost him his fortune, his position, his reputation. It would be unfortunate if they cost you your livelihood as well." Harold moved protectively in front of Emma. "Leave her out of this. Your quarrel is with me." "Actually, Mr. Whitman, I think Miss Emma might be exactly what we need to resolve this situation amicably." Morrison gestured to one of his associates, who stepped forward with a briefcase. "We're prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience this situation may have caused her." The associate opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of cash. Emma had never seen so much money in one place. It looked like enough to pay her rent for several years, maybe even enough to go back to school like she'd always dreamed. "All we need," Morrison continued, "is for you to convince your friend Harold to be reasonable. Return the documents, sign a new confidentiality agreement, and everyone walks away happy. Mr. Whitman gets to live out his remaining years in peace, and you get to start a new life with a substantial nest egg." Emma stared at the money, her mind racing. She thought about her tiny apartment with the leaky faucet and broken heater, about the college applications she'd never been able to afford to submit, about the dreams she'd put on hold to survive. That briefcase represented everything she'd ever wanted: security, opportunity, a chance at something better. But then she looked at Harold, saw the resignation in his eyes, the defeat in his shoulders. She thought about David Martinez, the young man who'd died because Harold had chosen money over safety. She thought about all the other potential victims who might suffer if Whitman Industries continued to operate without accountability. "How much?" Emma asked quietly. Morrison's smile widened with triumph. $50,000. Cash. No questions asked. No taxes to worry about. "All yours. Right now. Just for being a good friend." Emma walked slowly toward the briefcase, aware that everyone in the diner was watching her. Harold's eyes were filled with pain, but he didn't try to stop her. Morrison stepped aside, giving her room to approach the money. Emma reached out and touched one of the stacks of bills. It felt real, substantial, life-changing. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what she could do with it. The apartment she could afford, the education she could pursue, the future she could build. Then she thought about Harold's shaking hands, his gentle smile, his morning ritual of treating her like she mattered. She thought about his courage in walking away from power and privilege when his conscience demanded it. She thought about the choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right. Emma picked up the entire briefcase and, in one swift motion, slammed it shut and handed it back to Morrison's stunned associate. "I don't want your money," Emma said firmly. "And Harold doesn't need to be reasonable with people who value profits over human lives." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You're making a very serious mistake, Miss Emma. You have no idea what kind of forces you're opposing." "Maybe not," Emma replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I know what kind of man Harold is. I know he spent months eating breakfast here, being kind to everyone, tipping generously even though he can barely afford it. I know he treats me with more respect and dignity than I've ever received from anyone, and I know that if he says those documents could save lives, then they need to see the light of day." Harold was staring at Emma with wonder and something that looked like pride. "Emma, you don't understand what you're getting yourself into." "Then explain it to me," Emma said, turning to face him. "Tell me exactly what's in those documents and what we need to do to make sure the right people see them." Morrison's composure finally cracked. "This is your last warning, Mr. Whitman. Return the documents voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take more direct action." Harold straightened to his full height, and for a moment, Emma could see the powerful executive he'd once been. "The documents are in a place where your employers will never find them. And after today's display, I think it's time the world learned the truth about Whitman Industries." The tension in the room was electric. Morrison's associates had moved closer, their intentions clearly threatening. But Emma stood her ground beside Harold, no longer afraid. She had made her choice. Now they had to live with the consequences. Morrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and Emma could see a vein pulsing at his temple. The pleasant facade of civilized negotiation had completely dropped away, replaced by something much more dangerous. "You've made a very costly mistake," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a menace that made Emma's skin crawl. "Both of you." Harold gripped his cane tighter and stepped closer to Emma. "Morrison, whatever you're planning, remember that there are witnesses here. This is a public place." Morrison glanced around the now empty diner. Marcus had retreated behind the counter, but Emma could see him reaching for something, hopefully the phone to call for help. The other staff members had disappeared entirely, likely sensing the danger and getting as far away as possible. "Witnesses?" Morrison smiled coldly. "I see a confused old man having a medical emergency, and a young woman who unfortunately got caught in the middle of a tragic situation." The threat was no longer subtle, and Emma felt genuine fear course through her body. These weren't just corporate lawyers. They were people willing to hurt anyone who stood in their way. "The documents," Morrison continued, "will be found among Mr. Whitman's personal effects after his unfortunate passing. Sadly, in his confused mental state, he'll have destroyed most of them, leaving only fragments that prove nothing." Harold's breathing had become labored, and Emma realized the stress of the confrontation was taking a physical toll on him. His face was pale, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Harold, are you okay?" Emma asked urgently. "Just need my medication," Harold gasped, reaching into his jacket pocket with trembling fingers. Morrison nodded to one of his associates, who moved to block Harold's access to his medication. "I'm afraid we can't allow that, Mr. Whitman. We wouldn't want you to accidentally overdose in your agitated state." Emma's protective instincts flared into overdrive. She lunged toward Harold's attacker, but another associate grabbed her arm roughly, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Let go of me!" Emma shouted, struggling against the man's hold. "Emma, don't fight them," Harold pleaded, but his voice was getting weaker. Just let them have what they want." "No," Emma said firmly, even as the man's grip tightened painfully on her arm. "I won't let them hurt you." In that moment, Emma heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. Marcus must have called the police when Morrison's threats became obvious. Morrison heard them too, and his controlled expression flickered with annoyance. "Release her," he ordered his associate. "We're leaving." "What about the old man?" the associate asked. Morrison studied Harold, who was now leaning heavily on his cane, his breathing shallow and rapid. "He's not going anywhere in that condition. We'll deal with this properly later, somewhere more private." The sirens were getting louder now, and Emma could see flashing lights through the diner's front windows. Morrison and his men moved toward the back exit, but Morrison paused at the door. "This isn't over, Mr. Whitman. You have 24 hours to reconsider your position. After that, we'll be forced to take more permanent measures." As soon as they were gone, Emma rushed to Harold's side. He was slumping against the counter, his face gray and his breathing labored. "Harold, where's your medication?" Emma asked frantically. Harold pointed weakly toward his jacket pocket. Emma quickly retrieved a small bottle of pills and helped Harold take one, supporting him as he struggled to swallow. The police burst through the front door just as Harold began to stabilize. 2 officers, a middle-aged man and a younger woman, surveyed the scene with professional alertness. "We got a call about a disturbance," the male officer said. "Is everyone all right here?" Marcus emerged from behind the counter, his face flushed with stress. "These men were threatening my customers and staff. They just left through the back exit." Emma looked down at Harold, who was now breathing more normally but still pale and shaken. She realized that calling the police might have saved them temporarily, but it had also escalated the situation. Morrison and his associates weren't going to give up. They'd just become more careful about their methods. "Officer," Emma said quietly, "we need to talk. But not here. It's not safe." The female officer, whose name tag read Martinez, studied Emma's expression carefully. "Are you in immediate danger?" Emma glanced toward the back exit where Morrison had disappeared. "Yes, I think we are. These people aren't going to stop, and they're not afraid to hurt innocent people to get what they want." Officer Martinez looked at Harold, taking in his frail condition in obvious distress. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" Harold shook his head slowly. "No, just need to rest." "But the young lady is right. We're not safe here anymore. Can you tell me what this is about?" Officer Martinez asked. Emma looked at Harold, knowing this was the moment of truth. They could try to downplay the situation, send the police away, and hope Morrison would leave them alone. Or they could tell the truth and trust that the system would protect them. Harold seemed to read her thoughts. With great effort, he straightened up and looked directly at Officer Martinez. "My name is Harold Whitman," he said slowly, "and I have evidence of corporate crimes that could save lives. But the people responsible are trying to silence me permanently." Officer Martinez's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, she recognized the name. "Harold Whitman, as in Whitman Industries?" "Former CEO," Harold confirmed, "and currently a wanted man for having a conscience." The officer looked between Harold and Emma, processing the implications. "I think we need to take this conversation somewhere more secure. Both of you need to come with us, for your own protection." Emma helped Harold to his feet, supporting him as they walked toward the police car. As they stepped outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Morrison might be gone, but she doubted he'd gone far. "Harold," Emma said quietly as they reached the patrol car. "Those documents, we need to get them before Morrison figures out where they are." Harold nodded grimly. "The safety deposit box at First National Bank on Maple Street." "But Emma, once we retrieve those documents, there's no going back." Morrison wasn't exaggerating about the forces we're opposing. Emma looked back at the diner where she'd spent the last 8 months serving coffee and building a simple life. That life was over now, she realized. But maybe, just maybe, they could build something better from the ashes. "Then we better make sure we do this right," Emma said, helping Harold into the police car. "For David Martinez, and for everyone else who's counting on us." The police station was a stark contrast to the warm, familiar atmosphere of Sunrise Diner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Emma and Harold sat in a conference room, surrounded by officers, federal agents, and what appeared to be representatives from the district attorney's office. Word of Harold Whitman's reappearance had spread quickly through law enforcement circles. Detective Sarah Collins, a veteran investigator with kind eyes and graying hair, had taken charge of the case. She'd spent the last hour listening to Harold's story with the patience of someone who'd heard countless confessions and testimonies over her career. "Mr. Whitman," Detective Collins said gently, "these are serious allegations. If even half of what you're telling us is true, we're looking at multiple federal crimes: fraud, conspiracy, negligent homicide, environmental violations. The scope is staggering." Harold nodded wearily. The stress of the morning had aged him visibly, but there was also something like relief in his eyes. After years of carrying this burden alone, he was finally sharing it with people who could act on it. "The documents will prove everything," Harold said. "Financial records, internal emails, safety reports that were buried, communications with government officials who were bought off. It's all there." Agent Rebecca Foster from the FBI leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, you understand that by coming forward with this information, you're also implicating yourself in these crimes. You could face serious charges." "I know," Harold replied quietly. "I've known that for 2 years. It's why I ran, why I tried to disappear. But I can't live with the knowledge that more people might die because of my cowardice." Emma reached over and took Harold's trembling hand in hers. "You're not a coward. You're the bravest person I know." Detective Collins smiled at the gesture. "Miss Emma, can you tell us how you became involved in this situation?" Emma looked around the room at all the serious faces, still somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly her simple life had become the center of a major criminal investigation. "I just served him breakfast," Emma said simply. "Every morning for 8 months, Harold came into the diner where I work. He was kind, polite, generous with his tips, even though he clearly didn't have much money. When I saw him struggling with his arthritis, I helped him. When he looked lonely, I sat with him. I had no idea who he really was." "And when you found out?" Agent Foster asked. Emma thought about the moment in the break room when Harold had revealed his true identity, the weight of guilt and shame he'd been carrying. "It didn't change anything," Emma said firmly. "Harold is Harold, whether he's a former CEO or just an old man who needs help cutting his toast. He's shown me more kindness and respect than most people ever have. When those men threatened him, threatened both of us, I knew I had to stand by him." Detective Collins exchanged glances with Agent Foster. "Miss Emma, you should know that your decision to support Mr. Whitman may have saved lives. If he'd continued hiding, if Whitman Industries had been allowed to continue operating without oversight—" "How many?" Harold asked suddenly, his voice breaking. "How many more accidents have there been since I left?" Agent Foster consulted a file she'd brought with her. 3 workplace incidents resulting in serious injuries, 2 environmental spills that were covered up, and ongoing safety violations at 12 different facilities. No fatalities, but several workers have suffered permanent disabilities." Harold closed his eyes and Emma saw tears leaking from the corners. The knowledge that his silence had allowed more suffering was clearly devastating to him. "We can stop it now," Emma said firmly. "That's what matters. We can stop it from happening again." A knock on the conference room door interrupted the conversation. Officer Martinez, the policewoman from the diner, entered with a concerned expression. "Detective Collins, we've got a problem. The bank manager at First National reports that someone attempted to access Mr. Whitman's safety deposit box about an hour ago. They were turned away because they didn't have proper authorization, but—" "Morrison's people," Harold said grimly. "They're trying to get to the documents first." Agent Foster stood up quickly. "We need to get to that bank now, before they find another way in." The drive to First National Bank felt surreal to Emma. She was riding in an FBI vehicle, surrounded by federal agents, heading to retrieve documents that could topple one of the country's largest corporations. A week ago, her biggest concern had been whether she'd have enough tip money to pay her electric bill. At the bank, they were met by a nervous manager named Patricia Williams, who led them quickly to the safety deposit box area. The security footage from earlier showed 3 men in expensive suits attempting to access Harold's box, claiming to be his legal representatives. They had what appeared to be legal documents, Patricia explained. But something felt wrong about the situation. When I asked for additional verification, they became agitated and left. Harold's hands were shaking as he opened the safety deposit box with his key. Inside were dozens of folders, USB drives, and what appeared to be backup hard drives. Years of evidence, meticulously collected and preserved. Agent Foster whistled low under her breath as she saw the volume of material. This is going to take weeks to process properly. There's something else, Harold said, reaching into the back of the box. He pulled out a thick envelope sealed with wax. David Martinez's personal file. Everything about the accident that killed him, including the email chains showing how the cover-up was orchestrated. Emma watched as Harold handed the envelope to Detective Collins with trembling hands. This wasn't just evidence. It was Harold's attempt at atonement, his way of honoring the memory of the young man whose death had haunted him for 2 years. Mr. Whitman, Detective Collins said softly, what you're doing here today, it won't bring David Martinez back, but it might prevent other families from going through what his family did. As the agents and detectives carefully cataloged and secured the evidence, Emma noticed Harold staring out the bank's window with a strange expression on his face. Harold? What is it? Morrison, Harold said quietly. He's out there. Emma looked where Harold was pointing and saw the familiar figure of James Morrison standing across the street, watching the bank entrance with undisguised fury. Even from a distance, she could see the anger in his posture, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. Agent Foster followed their gaze and immediately radioed for backup units. Looks like Mr. Morrison is about to have a very bad day. As they prepared to leave the bank with the evidence secured, Emma realized that this was the moment everything would change. Harold's long exile was over, but so was their quiet morning routine at the diner. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But first, James Morrison and Whitman Industries were about to learn that some secrets can't stay buried forever. 6 months later, Emma walked through the doors of Sunrise Diner with a sense of bittersweet nostalgia. The familiar chime of the bell, the smell of coffee and bacon, the worn vinyl booths, everything was exactly the same, yet everything had changed. Marcus greeted her with a warm smile and a bear hug. Emma, how's college treating you? Emma grinned, adjusting the strap of her backpack filled with textbooks. Criminal justice isn't easy, but it's exactly what I want to be doing. The full-ride scholarship to the state university had been unexpected, funded by an anonymous donor who'd been inspired by Emma's courage in standing up to corporate corruption. She had her suspicions about who that donor might be, but Harold would never admit to it. He's at his usual table, Marcus said, nodding toward the corner booth by the window. Harold was indeed sitting in his familiar spot, but he looked dramatically different from the frail, frightened man who used to struggle with his breakfast. He was still elderly, still moved carefully, but there was a strength in his posture now, a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. Good morning, Harold, Emma said, sliding into the booth across from him with the ease of long familiarity. Good morning, dear, Harold replied, his eyes twinkling with genuine happiness. How were your midterm exams? Aced them all, Emma said proudly. Professor Williams says I have a natural instinct for investigative work. Harold chuckled. I could have told her that. You certainly investigated me thoroughly enough. Emma laughed, remembering those terrifying days when Harold's past had exploded into their quiet lives. The aftermath had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and life-changing revelations. James Morrison and 17 other Whitman Industries executives had been arrested within weeks of Harold's testimony. The evidence Harold had preserved proved to be even more damning than anyone had anticipated. The company faced billions in fines, criminal charges, and civil lawsuits from victims and their families. Have you heard the latest? Harold asked, pulling out a newspaper and spreading it on the table between them. The headline read, Whitman Industries bankruptcy approved. Assets to fund, victim compensation fund. Emma scanned the article quickly. The company that had once been worth billions was being liquidated, its assets used to compensate the families affected by its negligence and to fund workplace safety initiatives. David Martinez's daughter will have her college tuition paid for, Harold said quietly, pointing to a paragraph in the article. His wife is starting a foundation for workplace safety advocacy. Emma saw tears gathering in Harold's eyes and reached across to take his hand. Even 6 months later, the guilt over David's death still weighed heavily on Harold's conscience. You didn't save David, Emma said gently, But you saved the people who would have been hurt after him. That has to count for something. Harold nodded, wiping his eyes with his napkin. Some days I believe that. Other days you remember that you're human, Emma finished, and that humans make mistakes. But the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's what they do when they have the chance to make things right. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. "Mr. Whitman?" the woman said hesitantly. Harold looked up, and Emma saw recognition dawn in his eyes. "Mrs. Martinez?" The woman nodded. "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I heard this was where you like to have breakfast." Harold started to stand, but Maria Martinez gently motioned for him to stay seated. She slid into the booth next to Emma, settling her daughter on her lap. "I wanted to thank you," Maria said simply, "for what you did, for making sure David didn't die for nothing." Harold's hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from arthritis or fear. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry. If I had made different choices earlier, if I had been braver." "Stop," Maria said firmly. "You can't change what happened to David, but because of your courage, other husbands will come home to their wives. Other children will grow up with their fathers. That's David's legacy now, and yours." Emma watched as Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a small framed photograph. It showed a young man in work clothes, smiling broadly with his arm around Maria and baby Isabella. "This is David," Maria said, placing the photo on the table. "I wanted you to see him, to know he was a real person with dreams and plans and people who loved him." Harold picked up the photo with reverent care, studying David's face. "He looks like he was a good man." "He was," Maria confirmed, "and he would have wanted his death to mean something. You made sure it did." Maria stood to leave, but paused at the edge of the booth. "Mr. Whitman, David always said that good people make bad choices sometimes, but it's the willingness to face those choices that makes them good people again. I think he would have liked you." After Maria left, Harold and Emma sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The weight of the past 6 months, the trials and tribulations, the media scrutiny and legal proceedings all seemed to settle into this moment of quiet redemption. "So what's next?" Emma asked finally. Harold smiled, and Emma was struck by how much younger he looked when he wasn't carrying the burden of his secrets. "Well, I've been thinking about that. There's talk of starting a non-profit organization focused on corporate whistleblower protection. Turns out my experience might be useful to other people who find themselves in similar situations." "That sounds perfect," Emma said. "And what about us? Our morning routine?" Harold's smile widened. "Well, I'll be in town for the foreseeable future, and I hear you come home from college most weekends." "I do indeed," Emma confirmed. "Same time? Same place?" "Wouldn't miss it, dear." As Emma prepared to leave for her afternoon classes, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. A simple act of kindness, helping an elderly man with his breakfast, had led to one of the biggest corporate corruption cases in recent history. But more than that, it had taught her something valuable about the power of human connection, about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and about the possibility of redemption, even after terrible mistakes. She thought about David Martinez, whose death had been the catalyst for everything that followed. His sacrifice hadn't been in vain. It had led to new safety regulations, corporate accountability measures, and a justice system victory that would protect countless future workers. She thought about Harold, who had found the courage to face his past and make amends for his mistakes. His redemption hadn't come without cost. He'd lost his fortune, faced criminal charges, though he'd ultimately received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and endured months of public scrutiny. But he'd also found peace, purpose, and the friendship of people who valued him for who he was, not what he'd once been. And she thought about herself, a young woman who'd gone from serving coffee to helping expose corporate corruption, from struggling to pay rent to pursuing a degree in criminal justice. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most ordinary acts of human kindness. As Emma walked out of Sunrise Diner and into the crisp autumn air, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead in her studies and career, she would face them with the same courage Harold had shown when he decided to do the right thing. The bell chimed one last time as the door closed behind her, a sound that would forever remind her that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in small diners where ordinary people choose to treat each other with extraordinary kindness.